Hello, welcome to Fred Dinenage's Murder Casebook Re-Opened. I'm Hayley Rhodes, and this, of course, is Fred Dinenage. How are you?
I'm okay, and I'm fascinated to talk about this particular case because it is one of the most intriguing in British legal history.
The Derek Bentley case is one of the most tragic and staining cases in the history of our criminal justice system.
It was the single biggest nail in the coffin of capital punishment in this country.
I never got to meet an uncle that I absolutely idolise. I miss not meeting that person.
So this is the case of Derek Bentley, who in 1953, at the age of 19, was hanged for murder. Why did this case capture your imagination? Why is it something we're still talking about all these years later?
This case changed the whole course of legal history because Derek Bentley was hanged for murder, but a murder that he didn't actually commit. Somebody else committed it, and he actually was in police apprehension at the time. Interesting character, Derek Bentley, because from the word go, everything seemed to be against him in life. Indeed, in our programme, Professor David Wilson said everything about Derek Bentley and his life was unlucky. He just didn't have any luck at all. When he was 4 years old, he fell off the back of a lorry. He was playing on a lorry. He fell, hurt his head. And his parents said that's where his mental health problems really started to arrive. Epilepsy, fits, seizures, terrible sort of learning difficulties as well. They say that happened when he was 4 years of age. I'm not sure whether he was in fact born with all these mental health issues. We will never know. To add to the complications, during the Blitz, his sister, who he adored, was killed. He was involved in a house that was knocked down by a German bomb, and he was covered in rubble himself. So from the very word go, everything seemed to be against Derek Bentley, and he had terrible learning difficulties. And even when he was an adult, a teenager, he had an age of about an 8-year-old.
Yeah, he really struggled. He struggled at school. He didn't pass his 11 plus, which is not unusual, but he was, by the time he kind of reached his teenage years, he was illiterate. He hadn't really learned to read and write yet. And as he kind of moved into his teenage years, he dropped out of school and he started getting himself into trouble.
He did. I mean, school was a major problem for him. I mean, often his mum would go to school with him and sit with him to try and help him through the lessons. But he really struggled. He couldn't cope with the alphabet. He couldn't even write his own name, poor lad. Went to secondary school, suffered a lot from bullying because of his mental health difficulties there. Got into a little bit, he was easily led. He was a big lad, he was a strong lad, but he was a simple lad. You know, he was quite a kind lad, actually, but easily led by others. Mm-hmm. Got into a bit of minor crime, pilfering, this sort of thing. Got sent to an approved school in Bristol, Kingswood approved school, for 3 years, and really, really struggled there because he was constantly beaten at this school.
Yeah, so you interviewed an educational psychologist from the school, a guy called Hugh Moore, and his recollection is that it was a pretty brutal regime there.
Yeah, Hugh Moore was a fascinating character. He was one of the teachers there. The pupils there loved Hugh Moore because he was one of the few teachers in the school who didn't believe in punishment, in punishing the pupils. And he liked Derek Bentley. He saw the goodness.
Yeah, you can tell he had a soft spot for him.
He did. You know, he saw the goodness in this lad, this simple lad who actually had a good heart, quite a kind heart.
I had to go so frequently to Mr. Adams' office,
The head teacher,
the principal, and witness the beatings. With Derek particularly, he was beaten for these very minor offences. And I looked so worried when I came out with him. He said to me, don't worry, Slash, he said, I've got corns on my bum. It doesn't worry me at all. He said, it's no problem as far as I'm concerned.
Oh, it's awful though. It's awful to imagine this boy who's already having trouble comprehending the world ending up in an institution like that where he's just being beaten left, right and centre. It's a horrible thought.
Yeah, I mean, it was obviously a terrible place to be. And this particular teacher was a caring teacher, probably quite a rarity.
Yes, I imagine it was,
And Derek Bentley loved him and trusted him. And when he finally came out of the approved school and went home, he kind of self-isolated became a bit of a recluse for some months.
I wonder if he was traumatised. I wonder if that was...
I'm sure he was totally traumatised by the treatment he'd had in this approved school. It had a terrible, catastrophic effect on him, really, because he was a lad that was struggling anyway, mentally, with his comprehension and everything else. After about 6 months, he tried to get work. He joined a furniture removal firm, but lifting all the heavy, even though he was a big, strong boy, it was still too much for him. He hurt his back, so he had to stop that job. He got a job with Croydon Council as a refuse collector, but he wasn't very good at that. He wasn't very good at anything, really. So they said, right, okay, you can become a street cleaner. So he started to sweep the streets, and after a month, that didn't work out either, and they sacked him. And then he was completely at a loose end and probably the most vulnerable time in his whole life.
Yeah, I mean, his family, they were a really close family, and they do seem to have really tried to protect him. And he made friends around this time with a younger guy, Christopher Craig, who was 16 years old at this time, 1952, and his family didn't approve of this friendship.
No, Christopher Craig was the worst thing that could possibly have happened to Derek Bentley. Craig was a small fellow. He had 1 or 2 learning difficulties himself. He was dyslexic. He was tiny, but he was quite devious at the time. I mean, let's be fair about it. When all this was over many years later, Christopher Craig, seemed to have got himself on the right track, and we'll talk about that later. But at the time, I think he was quite devious. He was small, whereas Derek Bentley was a big, strong boy. And I think he saw in Bentley someone he could totally manipulate. And Bentley was a bit in awe of this. He was much younger, was Craig. But I think Bentley was a bit in awe of him and easily led by Craig. But Craig was a very, very bad influence. He kind of modelled himself on the Hollywood tough guys at the time on the cinema screen. He thought he was a tough guy. He was obsessed with weapons. He was obsessed with guns.
16-year-old Craig was from a respectable middle-class family and the youngest of 8. His ambition was to become a qualified gunsmith.
He's somebody, though, that's going to really say to Bentley, who's rather more timid and feeble, here are the kinds of things that we should be getting up to. And so that's where this kind of poisonous relationship develops between Craig and Bentley.
And this was at a time when, I guess, getting your hands on guns, actually, after the Second World War was probably not that difficult.
No, because there were so many weapons had been discarded after the war. It was fairly, relatively easy to get hold of weapons. So Christopher Craig had a whole cache of weapons in his bedroom at home in London. And in fact, he'd been prosecuted by the police on a couple of occasions for illegally holding weapons.
And criminologist David Wilson, you spoke to him in the programme about Chris's love of weapons, and he kind of talked about the way that it maybe gave Chris this kind of sense of being, tough guy image and emulating gangsters, as you say.
It was this tough guy thing he wanted, and he wanted to be a sort of Al Capone type figure. And he was only tiny and he wasn't that strong, but the weapons made him feel strong, so he had guns. He had guns and he had knives and he had a whole cache of weapons. And along came Derek Bentley, who he could manipulate. Bentley was ideal for Christopher Craig, but Derek Bentley's parents were horrified by Christopher Craig. Desperately tried to persuade Bentley not to be involved with him, but, it was water off a duck's back. He wasn't going to listen. Here's a strange thing, because life can be so strange. One of their friends was a policeman called Sidney Miles. And they went to Sidney Miles and said, do you think you could persuade Derek not to associate with this Christopher Craig, who was a well-known figure locally? And Miles tried to help. And of course, the terrible irony of the whole thing was, and we'll get onto this later, but in the end, the policeman that Christopher Craig shot dead, that led to the hanging of Derek Bentley, was the same policeman, Sidney Miles. I mean, what a strange coincidence that was. But despite all the pressures on him to pack up this friendship with Christopher Craig, Derek Bentley was having none of it. He kind of worshipped Craig in a strange sort of, in his simple way.
Well, I can understand that. I mean, when you've never really had many friends, when you've only ever really been bullied at school, and then you've got somebody who wants to hang out with you and who you think is an impressive figure, I can see that he would have been really drawn to him. And maybe beggars can't be choosers when it comes to making friends if you haven't got many. So
Yes.
I can understand that.
Yeah, absolutely. But of course, you see, Craig was drawn to sort of, again, minor crime, and was going to drag Derek Bentley along with him, and Bentley was an easy target, if you like, you know. They were an odd couple, but they kind of worked together because each had something that the other one didn't have, you know.
Brilliant. So 2nd of November 1952, Derek Bentley and Christopher Craig, I think that night, so that day, Derek Bentley hadn't been feeling very well. He'd been to the cinema, but he had these blinding headaches that were, I guess, associated with his head injury and his epilepsy. And he'd come home and he'd had some rest. And then that evening, Christopher Craig had come knocking, and he had gone out with Christopher Craig, and they were looking for trouble by the sounds of things.
Yeah, it was a fatal mistake to have gone out with him that night, you know. And Craig was actually armed that night. Now, this is a big point of argument, you know. Did Derek Bentley know that Christopher Craig was armed? We'll talk about that. But Craig did have a gun, a handgun. The barrel had been sawn off, and he had bullets as well.
And initially the idea was to break into a butcher's shop. But when they got to the butcher's shop, the light was on, so they didn't go there. Craig then went a little further down the road, Tamworth Road, just around the corner here. But there was a wholesale confectioner's factory in the road, and that was a two-storey building with a flat roof at the top.
This is in Croydon,
In Croydon, in South London, yeah. So they got into the grounds of this warehouse, climbed up the fire escape onto the roof. Unbeknown to them, they'd been seen by a lady who lived over the road. And she said to her husband, "I've just seen two lads climbing on the roof of the warehouse over the road. Get the police." So they didn't have a phone, so he ran down the road to the nearest red telephone box, which we had in those days, and rang the police. And before long, the first policeman arrived at the scene. His name was DS Fred Fairfax. Detective Sergeant Fred Fairfax. He arrived and climbed up the fire escape as well, saw the two lads and said, "Stop, I'm going to arrest you." At which point Christopher Craig fired the gun and hit Fairfax, DS Fairfax, in the shoulder. Didn't kill him, wounded him. Fairfax very bravely ran towards both Bentley and Craig and pulled Bentley back, almost using him as a kind of human shield. And this is where it all started to go wrong, because by now, armed police are now on the way, and the first one to get up on that roof is PC Sidney Miles, a friend of the Bentley family, and the policeman they turned to try to separate this friendship between Craig and their son, Derek Bentley. He's the first one on the roof. Craig sees him, fires the gun, and kills Sidney Miles. He's dead. He shot him dead.
Some of the statements that are later made by Bentley in court and the police don't correspond. But seemingly, according to the police, what happens at that point is that Sergeant Fairfax, who's pushing Bentley forward because Craig's obviously got a gun, at which point it's alleged by the three police officers that Bentley says, "Let him have it, Chris."
Allegedly, those words were to start a chain of events that would leave one policeman injured and another dead.
Did he say it? If he did he mean shoot him, Chris, let him have it, Chris? Or did he mean give him the gun, Chris, you know, pack it up, give him the gun, let him have it? Christopher Craig obviously didn't pay any attention at all. He shot him. Derek Bentley claimed he never ever said that. Fairfax, the DS Fairfax, said he did say it. Interestingly, another policeman who was on the roof as well claims he never hurt Christopher Craig.
So Christopher Craig was firing on the police. He'd already hit 2 police officers. It seems like he was willing to go down in a blaze of glory at this point, but then his gun ran out of bullets.
It ran out of bullets, and he actually said, "Okay, that's it. I've got no more bullets. That's it. It's over." And that's when they arrested Christopher Craig. But I think if he'd had more bullets, another policeman at least probably would have lost his life.
And at that point, he actually didn't go easily. He ran out of bullets, and then he leapt off the top of the building. So about 30 foot to the ground.
Yeah, he did. He jumped off the top of the building and landed on a greenhouse and injured himself quite badly.
Fractured his spine, I think, maybe a broken wrist, something like that.
He did.
So he was actually then carted off to hospital under police custody.
Yes, he was. And of course, poor old Derek Bentley was taken to the police station and eventually, as you know, charged with murder.
Even though he hadn't fired a single shot.
He hadn't fired a single shot, and he was, according to him and according to others, in police custody at the time. In other words, he's being apprehended by a policeman at the time that Christopher Craig shot dead the policeman.
And what's interesting, so both of them, Christopher Craig and Derek Bentley, both charged with the murder of Sidney Miles and I think the attempted murder of Fred Fairfax, who was also shot.
Bentley's family had no idea of the events their son had been involved in that evening.
Mum had stayed up late that night because Derek had gone out with his friend. Next thing, the doorbell went and police came in and said that Derek's been arrested for murder.
So Derek Bentley would have been prosecuted under this idea of joint enterprise in that he went with Christopher Craig, knowing that Christopher Craig was armed, knowing what could have happened, and so therefore he was as guilty as Christopher Craig. And I know that you spoke to a human rights lawyer called Benedict Bernberg, and he talked about the fact that once Derek Bentley was in the police's custody, then any tacit agreement of joint enterprise would actually effectively have been broken by him being in custody. He was no longer party to Christopher Craig's actions.
Yeah, I mean, he felt very, very strongly about that because he was convinced that Derek Bentley was being apprehended by a policeman at the time, therefore wasn't in any position to have actually taken part in the actual killing, the actual shooting of the policeman. And he was very strong about that and fought Derek Bentley's case for many years.
Yeah, absolutely. And there was also discrepancies. There was also a dispute really about the way that Derek Bentley's statement was taken. And again, you spoke to a forensic linguist called Dr. John Olson, and he talked about having read back Derek Bentley's statement as given to the police and how things about it didn't really ring true, especially given Derek Bentley's, mental age and illiterateness.
He was illiterate and he couldn't, as I say, he couldn't even spell his own name. And yet the statement seemed incredibly lucid, for a man with such learning difficulties. That was the interesting thing about it. And also he picked up on specific things, in this statement, which really, he was convinced that the whole thing wasn't a lucid statement by Derek Bentley. It was in actual fact a series of questions put to Bentley by the police, and these were his responses.
Years later, it's believed these statements may not have been the exact words of Bentley, a man with an estimated mental age of 8.
His first reference to the gun is as a definite article, so he says, "I did not know he was going to use the gun." And it would appear that he said that completely spontaneously. So first of all, it's a spontaneous negative, "I did not know." And second of all, no reference to the gun up until now.
Whereas Bentley said, "I didn't say that. I said, I didn't know he had a gun."
Yeah, I didn't know he was going to use a gun, which means that he didn't know he'd bought a gun in the first place, which means that he can't have been held responsible for the fact that Christopher Craig had a gun and fired it because he didn't know about it. And so there are these real discrepancies, which when it came to trial in, I think it was December 1952, so he was charged with murder, as was Christopher Craig, and when it came to trial, his defence, I think it's fair to say Derek Bentley's defence didn't do a great job of putting any of these arguments across.
No, I think that's putting it absolutely mildly, because in actual fact, the Bentley family didn't have money, so they couldn't afford to hire a top lawyer to defend their son. So they used a lawyer, a solicitor that the court supplied for them. And he clearly believed that Derek Bentley was guilty, and he really offered no real defence at all. You know, he just almost said, look, my client's guilty of murder, do what you want with him.
Absolutely. I mean, and Derek Bentley took the stand, and as somebody with learning difficulties, you know, the mental age is somewhere between an 8 and a 10-year-old, he stood on the stand and was absolutely torn apart by the prosecution, and he couldn't even comprehend the flow of questions, let alone adequately answer them. And so putting him on the stand again did him no favours.
Oh, it was terrible. I mean, mentally, you're talking really about the equivalent of a small young child being put on the stand, being accused of murder, being battered by a prosecution lawyer, you know. So he had absolutely no chance at all. And obviously, in the end, he was found guilty, but the jury did recommend mercy.
And despite this recommendation of mercy from the jury, the judge, when he passed sentence, he went for the death penalty.
Yeah, the Judge Goddard had no mercy on Derek Bentley at all.
Even after the sentencing by Lord Chief Justice Goddard, the Bentley family hoped for a reprieve. His case was presented to the Court of Appeal on the 13th of January 1953, but it was quickly dismissed. The sentence of death remained.
I think what counted against Derek Bentley so much was the fact that the victim in all this was a serving police officer, you know, and that obviously caused so much anger amongst the authorities, and I think that would have counted so much against. And I think it was a terrible, terrible miscarriage of justice. I really do.
And that is how the public felt at the time. There was public outcry, and once again, we saw this a couple of years later with the Ruth Ellis case, which you also covered in your murder casebook, is that the public opinion was actually at odds with the authorities, and you've almost got this elites versus ordinary people where the public are saying, well, not only is the death penalty wrong, but executing this young man who quite clearly is not all there is also wrong.
There was a massive hue and cry, it really was. And in our murder casebook programme, the actual expression used was, this was the biggest nail in the coffin of capital punishment. Because this case actually, and later Ruth Ellis, really were the two big arguments for getting rid of capital punishment, whether you think that's right or wrong, given some of the things that happen these days. But nonetheless, and I think the case of Derek Bentley was the biggest thing of all in the abolition of hanging, of capital punishment in the United Kingdom.
I can only imagine how Derek Bentley's family felt. They must have felt, I mean, first disbelief, because this wasn't an outcome that any reasonable person could have seen coming. No. But also just the impotence that this was going to happen to their son, and there was nothing they could do to stop it.
You can imagine, can't you, them, you know, in their little home in South London, listening to the radio and knowing that their son is being hanged.
A crowd of around 500 gathered outside Wandsworth Prison and sang "The Lord is my shepherd and abide with me." Derek William Bentley, aged just 19, had been hanged.
Mum was always said that there was a clock on the mantelpiece in the sitting room, and it struck 9 o'clock, and Nanny just collapsed because someone had just killed her son. From a young, vibrant Nan, from pictures I've got of her, she aged 50 years in a matter of moments.
So you, for the programme, you actually interviewed Derek Bentley's niece, Maria, and she'd never met him, but the way she spoke about him was as though she had.
Do you know, I found Maria an absolutely fascinating lady because, yes, she knew everything about Derek Bentley. She knew everything about the family. She obviously cared about his memory. She loved the family. And to be fair, she really supported Derek Bentley's sister Iris, who campaigned for so many, many years to get him a pardon, to get the conviction quashed, the murder conviction quashed. And Maria really, really helped Iris in that campaign. She was absolutely tireless about it, you know, and she helped her constantly. Sadly, Iris didn't live long enough to see the completion of the whole thing, but Maria did, and Maria kind of, when it was all official and Derek Bentley had been cleared, Maria had still got a bottle of champagne that Derek Bentley's dad had kept for many, many years, and he'd said, you know, when my son is cleared of this crime which he didn't commit, we're going to have this bottle of champagne. And of course he died, and the mum died. And Maria, although she never met him, I think she really, really got him, you know, and helped Iris incredibly in the battle to clear his name.
And yet it took until 1993 for him to be pardoned. And the family weren't satisfied with that, which is rightly so, because a pardon says you did it, but essentially we've forgiven you. It took another 5 years after that for the conviction to be completely overturned.
I myself wanted more than a pardon. I wanted to show that, in fact, Derek had been wrongly convicted in the first place, that he, in fact, was an innocent man who didn't need a pardon because he was innocent. He should never have been convicted.
Yes, it was. And that's where Maria comes into it, who was in our murder casebook programme, and that bottle of champagne was finally opened that Derek Bentley's dad had bought all those years before, believing that one day his son would be cleared of it all. The champagne was opened.
On the 30th of July 1998, more than 4 decades after Derek Bentley's death, the Court of Appeal quashed the murder conviction. The Lord Chief Justice, Lord Bingham, criticised the original judge's summation, saying the trial was such as to deny the appellant that fair trial, which is the birthright of every British citizen.
And for the family, and for his sister Iris, who'd battled for 40 years to get this result and then never actually saw it in the end.
No, she died not very long before.
Oh, how very sad was that? How very sad. The whole Bentley story.
It's tragic.
Yeah, you know, what a family, how cursed they were and how unfair it all was. You know, it really was.
What we should say is what happened to Christopher Craig. So he was 16 at the time of Sidney Mal's murder, and so he was prosecuted for murder, but he could not be given the death penalty.
Christopher Craig was given 10 years in prison, and as far as I know, at the end of those 10 years, came out of prison, got himself a completely new life, got married, had a family, got a job, as far as I know. Little is known about what actually did happen to him, although when Derek Bentley was pardoned eventually, Christopher Craig did come out and make a statement saying he was really, really happy for the Bentley family, and he apologised to the Bentley family for his part in the demise of their son, and he apologised to his own family for all the unwanted press scrutiny and media scrutiny that they'd had for many, many years. So I think, you know, he genuinely felt very badly about it, as indeed he should have done, because basically he'd cost his friend his life.
He had, and actually we shouldn't forget that he cost Sidney Miles his life, and he's someone that in all of the hue and cry gets slightly lost in all of this. He was apparently a dedicated, brave police officer who had died in the course of duty, and actually, because of the uproar about Derek Bentley's execution, actually probably didn't get as much coverage as he perhaps deserved.
No, and I think Maria said he was a good man and a good friend to the whole Bentley family, and he paid for it with his life, and he was a good copper, you know, and I think that's one of the saddest things in this whole story. And
Derek Bentley, this guy with a really quite a poor understanding of the world, was hanged, and I can only imagine how that felt for him.
I mean, it's just, the whole thing is beyond belief, isn't it, really? I mean, did he really understand what was going to happen to him, you know, when he's in his cell the night before he's hung? What was going through the poor chap's mind? You know, we're talking about a lad here with a mental age of 8, maybe 10 at the most. So he's a kid. He's a young kid. Yeah. And then he's brought into the chamber to be hung. What's going through his little mind? You know, how's he processing that? How's he coping with all that? You know, and he sees Pierpoint, the hangman, and the noose goes round his neck. You know, what's going through his mind? It beggars belief, doesn't it?
It's horrific.
You
It's
know,
absolutely, it does.
the authorities could do it to him, you know. And if ever there was a case for abolishing capital punishment because of the wrong person's been convicted, that's it, I suppose.
Yeah,
you
this
know,
is
no
the
matter
one.
what you feel about capital punishment, especially with all the crime that goes on these days, it's a tricky one, isn't it?
It's horrific. I don't even want to imagine how he felt.
I mean,
It's absolutely awful.
he was a simple lad. You know, he'd done a wrong thing, but he was easily led. Simple lad.
Absolutely, and the punishment for him really did not fit the crime.
No, and imagine if it's your 8 or 10-year-old kid in the dock accused of murder. How would he cope with that? How would you cope with that?
It's a devastating story, and one that ended up with a change in the law that was really important. So thank you for talking me through it.
I just think it was good to talk about this because it's such a crucial case in British legal history, and I'm grateful for the chance to talk about Derek Bentley, a young man I personally feel quite close to myself, having followed this story so closely. You know, and I feel deeply sorry for the whole family, so thanks for the opportunity.
Thank you, Fred, and that's it from us, so we'll see you next time. Hello, welcome to Fred Dinenage's Murder Casebook Reopened. I'm here with Fred. Today we are talking about someone who has been described as more dangerous than the Krays.
It didn't matter who his victims were, whether they were his family, workmates, school friends, they were just guinea pigs to him.
Yes, you know, I am fascinated by serial killers. I always have been. But this one in particular fascinates me, not because his body count was that high, because it wasn't in basic terms, but because the man was actually a bit of a genius. We're talking about Graham Young, the so-called teacup poisoner.
Graham Young was more dangerous than the Krays. No one could trust him.
A man whose knowledge of chemicals, of poisons, was so great that when he was spending his final days in Parkhurst Prison on the Isle of Wight, cosmetic companies would actually approach him for advice on the chemicals they should mix in their lipsticks and mascaras and things like that. The man was a genius when it came to chemicals and poisons. Sadly, he used his cleverness in precisely the wrong way. He used them on human beings, on fellow human beings.
It is a really, really fascinating case. I mean, he was a clever guy. So he was born in Neasden in North London, 1947, from a very ordinary family by the sounds of it.
Graham Young, yes, had an unhappy childhood, really, an unsettled childhood, as indeed many killers do seem to have. His mother died when he was a very young baby. His dad, Fred, couldn't cope with bringing up a young baby, so sort of farmed him out, really, to an auntie whom, as he grew up, he didn't really like. Then his father remarried a lady called Molly and called him back home to live with Fred, Molly, and his sister, Winifred.
So him and his stepmother were always at loggerheads by the sound of it, and her discipline methods sometimes really rubbed him up the wrong way. So, for example, she at one point destroyed his plane collection.
She destroyed his plane collection. He wasn't getting on well with her anyway. They were at loggerheads from the moment he returned home from his auntie's. But she destroyed, his beloved toy, and if you like, that was the last straw, and that's when her card was well and truly marked. He really, really didn't like her. He was always fascinated by chemicals and poisons, always fascinated as well by Nazism. He sort of had a thing about Hitler and the Nazis. It was a really big thing in his life from a very young age.
I suppose he was only born a couple of years after the Second World War, so all of that was very present at the time.
Very much so. He was always keen on chemistry and chemicals, an interest which was further enhanced when he was given a chemistry set when he passed his 11+ exam. And he started experimenting with mixing chemicals together and poisons, which he was able to get quite easily at that time, thallium, things like that.
So how was he actually getting hold of all of these substances he was hurting people with?
He would simply go to the local chemists and say, I need chemicals for my schoolwork, for my exams. And later he would say, I'm a university student, I need them for my university exams, for my experiments. And the chemists would fall for it.
He was clearly very charming, very plausible when he needed to be.
Very plausible, and of course had great knowledge of the chemicals that he required. So, he could really convince a chemist or anybody else that this was indeed part of his studies, part of his research, a necessary part of his research. And he started his sort of poisoning experiments on a schoolmate, a lad called Christopher Williams. And he started in break times when they were having their snacks or their drink of milk or whatever, inserting a bit of poison on his food or in his drink to see what the effects would be. And Christopher Williams began to fall quite ill, and having to take time off school. And on one occasion, when he was back at school, the two lads went to London Zoo. And while they were at London Zoo, Christopher Williams said, "Oh, I feel a bit thirsty." And Graham Young said, "Oh, I've got a nice drink here for you," and gave him a drink which was laced with poison. But Williams was lucky because in actual fact, he didn't kill him, because by then his attention was turning to his stepmother, Molly, whom he really disliked. And he began systematically poisoning his stepmother so that she became violently ill, violently sick. And he was also interfering with the food and drink of his dad and his older sister as well.
So you chatted with a journalist and author called Anthony Holden, who's written a book about this story. And he told you that no one at any point really suspected, despite his fascination with chemistry, despite the, I'm guessing, quite open animosity he showed towards his stepmother, no one suspected him of interfering with his family's food.
No, it's quite extraordinary. I mean, they didn't know what was causing the family to be so sick, but they sort of put it down to a viral illness or something like that. And then one day, Fred, his father, came home and found Molly, the stepmother, in the back garden, lying on the lawn, in absolute agony. And the father couldn't understand it, and although he'd been feeling not well himself, and the father looked up at a bedroom window, and there, staring down with cold eyes, was the young Graham Young, just looking at it, just taking it all in, but not doing anything. He's just staring, watching what was happening. Molly was rushed to hospital, and eventually she died. And it was all put down, I think, to the after effects of an accident she'd had, a motor accident she'd had some time before. There was no post-mortem, and she was cremated. And it obviously was a tremendously bad time for the father, Fred, who himself started to get more and more sick because Graham Young was feeding him more and more poison.
Graham Young never showed any sign of remorse, not just about killing his stepmother, who he may have had some objections to, but his own father, Fred, was permanently damaged, his liver, etc., by the poison that Graham fed to him. His sister Winifred was damaged. These were people who had been nice to him and friendly to him and paternal or sisterly. The last people you'd think he would go after, but they were just the nearest to hand.
You spoke with criminologist Professor David Wilson, and he said that Young was showing signs of psychopathy even from this early age, that ability to watch his stepmother, even if it was someone he didn't like, writhing in pain in the garden, clutching her stomach, screaming in agony, and to be completely impassive in that moment, suggests that he really did struggle with empathy.
Absolutely. And not only that, he was so cold-hearted about it, he would actually make notes about, how much poison he'd given his stepmother or his father or his sister. He'd keep a little documents noting down the amounts he'd given them, what he'd given them, and the effect it had had on them. And the father eventually got so ill, he was taken to hospital, and Graham Young went along to visit him. And the doctor was talking to the father, couldn't work out what the problem was, suggested that he had been sort of poisoned in some form or another. And Graham Young started butting in the conversation and correcting the doctor and saying, no, he's not taken that, he's taken this, he must have taken that amount. He was giving the game away, which of course was his eventual downfall anyway at the end of his criminal career. And the doctors were really, really suspicious by this time and carried out further examinations, discovered that in fact his father, Fred, had been poisoned. And that's when, for the first time, Graham Young was incarcerated.
So he was so keen to show off his knowledge that he just couldn't resist sharing his understanding of poisons and what they did. And then when the doctors contacted the police contacted the school, it turned out that his chemistry teacher had also got some concerns. And when he looked in his desk at school, he'd got all sorts of paraphernalia in there that he probably shouldn't have had as a 14-year-old boy. And they got a psychologist to interview him, and he actually managed to draw out from him the fact that he had been poisoning his family.
Yes, that's correct. And the paraphernalia he got in his school desk was absolutely amazing. And when they went to his home, of course, into his bedroom at his home, all sorts of things in there that he shouldn't have had.
When he's at school, he's useless in virtually every other subject except for chemistry. The chemistry teacher becomes suspicious. Other family members are suspicious of these continuing health problems in Young's family. And so the chemistry teacher finds poisons in his desk, calls the family doctor. The family doctor calls in a psychiatrist. The psychiatrist and the police interview Young on the pretext that his knowledge of chemistry is so great. Perhaps he's already at university level. Young, of course, revealing the true nature of the psychopath, the true nature of the serial killer, is desperate for the attention and, of course, shows off. His arrogance knows no bounds.
So he was sent to Broadmoor for GBH against his father and sister, which he'd admitted, but not for the murder of his stepmother Molly, because that's not what her post-mortem had said she died of. So he kind of got away with that one. But when he was sent to Broadmoor, he was just 14 years old. I mean, that's very young.
14 years of age it's incredible that someone of that age should be sent to Broadmoor to live alongside much older people with really serious mental problems. But he settled into Broadmoor all right and made great friends with Ian Brady, the Moors murderer, who shared with Graham Young a love of Hitler and Nazism.
As you say, he settled in really well to Broadmoor. There was one suspicious death in his first year or so of being there, a guy called John Berridge, who died of what was discovered to be cyanide poisoning.
Yeah, I mean, there's always the suggestion, whenever Graham Young's around, anyone who dies of some sort of poisoning, it's got to be him. Who knows? It's perfectly possible. It's perfectly possible.
I mean, it was obviously hard to get hold of chemicals we'd hope it'd be hard to get hold of chemicals in a secure mental institution. But there was a theory that that he had made cyanide from laurel leaves from bushes found in the grounds.
Well, he had done tremendous studies on poisons and where you can get them from. So it is quite possible, yes, that laurel leaves produced the necessary poison that he required. But Young, he was clever, because he knew if he behaved himself, he could get a shorter term inside Broadmoor, and indeed, that is what he eventually got. He got out after 8 years.
Although it took him a while to come to that realisation, because there were suspicions in the early year or so, the first year or so of his incarceration, that he was making little attempts to poison people, that he was perhaps dosing the tea urn, or when he was given responsibilities to hand out cups of tea to staff, and some of them were found to not taste quite right. So I think he was giving it a little go to begin with, but then he realised that was not the route to ever getting out.
No, I mean, it's probably true. I mean, I don't think Graham could stop himself from trying to poison people. I mean, he was a totally misguided genius, really, but he couldn't stop himself. And they even say when he eventually was in Parkhurst prison, there were strange things were happening in Parkhurst prison. But I don't know whether that's a myth or not. We could be being a bit harsh on him here.
Yeah, you chatted with Bobby Cummins, who was actually incarcerated in Parkhurst with him at the same time. So Bobby Cummins is an ex-offender, and he said that no one wanted a cup of tea made by him.
Yes, absolutely. Yeah, Bobby Cummins, who went down as Britain's youngest ever bank robber at the time, was in Parkhurst prison at the same time as Reggie Cray, and also Graham Young, the teacup poisoner. And Bobby said, yeah, obviously all the prisoners were extremely nervous about being anywhere near Graham Young, and certainly wouldn't share food or drink with him for obvious reasons.
Bobby, you've actually met him. What sort of bloke was he?
Well, let's put it this way, Fred. We're sitting here having a cup of tea. I think we'd not be picking up those cups if we had Graham in our company and know that he poured it. I wouldn't even say you drink it first to see whether it was all right, because the chances are he would know exactly how much to drink that wouldn't hurt him, and I'd drink it and it'd kill me. No, not in a million years. I wouldn't even sit on a table with him in case he dusted it with something. That's how dangerous. We're talking about, you know, as I said, he make the crazy look like any of the bad men, you know, look like amateur street fighters. This guy was deadly.
I wonder if that's something he enjoyed. I know that Professor David Wilson said that actually power and control is one of the kind of motivators for a lot of serial killers, and that idea that people fear and that you have the kind of power of life and death over people was probably quite appealing to him.
Oh, I think Graham Young would have absolutely loved that. Absolutely loved that aura he had around him, you know. And I mean, he was brilliant at conning people, and he conned the medical staff at Broadmoor into believing he was completely safe. He'd been completely a new man. You know, he'd been saved. He'd seen the error.
Youthful phase.
Yes, he'd seen the error of his ways. You know, he was going to be okay. He conned them. He absolutely conned them. And so eventually they said, right, you can go for a week's release to stay with your sister, who by this time his sister Winifred had married, had a young child. And Graham Young actually sent them a message saying, you know, Frankenstein is coming to stay with you. Yippee. You know, I mean, God knows what sort of a week they had, but he was as good as gold, obviously, because he wanted to impress the authorities and show them that he was safe to be released. It was an outrage, really, that the Broadmoor authorities let him out, because they were letting him out to kill.
So in 1971, he's in his early 20s by this point, and he is released, and he enters the world of work again, and he goes to a factory in Bovingdon in Hertfordshire, and he tells them that he's been incarcerated in a mental institution, but he fudges the reason why. He doesn't tell them it's for poisoning his loved ones.
No, I mean, it's extraordinary that he went. It was a company dealing in chemicals, with a factory full of chemicals. Not necessarily the sort of poisons that Graham Young wanted, but nonetheless, he got a job there. And the funny thing was, it was the Broadmoor authorities who helped to get him the job as a storeman in a chemical factory. This the guy who'd been poisoning his own family. It beggars belief, really. And there's a document which you can see in which the medical staff at Broadmoor say, this young man is fine. You can employ him. You know, he'll be a good employee. You know, he'll be an honest sort of chap. So he went to a chemical firm, as you say, in Hertfordshire.
He was trained as a storeman by the Broadmoor Release Service. The next astonishing irony of this story is the poison that Graham was by now interested in was called thallium, which is a heavy metal poison. And its main industrial use is in photography. There are 2 companies in this country that stock thallium in to manufacture photographic lenses. And the Broadmoor Placement Service found Graham Young a job in one of these 2 factories. A place called Hadland's Laboratories in a little village called Bovingdon, just outside Hemel Hempstead.
I mean, it's remarkable. You actually managed to speak with a man called Anthony Oddams, who had been one of his co-workers there, and who actually does remember him starting, said he was quite an unassuming, quiet young man. He was given the responsibility of handing out cups of tea, which is very much, his wheelhouse. Yeah,
I mean, they found him as a slightly silent, surly sort of companion. And the thing was, they all said, whatever you do, don't talk to him about Hitler or about the Nazis, because he'll go off on one, and he can't stop talking about it. So that was a subject they all absolutely avoided, because he was still mad about Nazism.
Well, when Graham arrived, it was understood that he'd come from some sort of rehabilitation as a result of a mental breakdown. He didn't strike one as being exceptional. He was very dark, somewhat glum, very articulate, clearly very intelligent, and he obviously conveyed through one means or another his knowledge of chemistry, and those that were curious asked him what he'd been and what he'd done in the past, and he said, well, I was actually a failed chemistry student or a failed pharmacist. So when those terms, any sort of medically related or chemistry terms were used, it didn't come as a great surprise, because that's what we believed him to have been. I do remember colleagues saying to me one day, as we were discussing him generally, just don't get him on the subject of Hitler and the Nazis because it's a favourite topic, and he'll be off on one basically. And we did smile about it and say, yes, okay, we'll keep well clear of that.
But yeah, I mean, they got on all right with him, and he had friends in there, but then systematically started to poison several, maybe as many as 10 of his colleagues. It was quite extraordinary. And then he'd again watch the effects of the poison on them and make notes about how much I've given to him and how much to him, and how sick they were. And some of them were violently ill, none more so than a man called Bob Eagle, who'd been friends with Graham Young. And Bob Eagle got terribly ill. And eventually, terrible bouts of sickness. And eventually he was taken to hospital where he died. And it was diagnosed in the hospital as bronchial pneumonia. Can you believe? They never spotted the poison at all. And Graham Young went to see his widow, Bob Eagle's widow, and suggest, that he be cremated. And she said, well, yeah, that's probably a good idea. So the body of this poor man was cremated. And not only that, the boss of the factory, the boss of this chemical factory, said to Graham Young, I'd like you to accompany me to the funeral of Bob Eagle. So he went to the funeral, the cremation of this man that he'd poisoned, that he'd killed. It beggars belief, doesn't it?
Bob Eagle was cremated. And in fact, it was Graham who went round to see the widow and explained to her that cremation was probably the best option these days. And as fate would have it, Hadland, the managing director, chose Graham Young to accompany him to the funeral on behalf of the company because he'd been Bob Eagle's friend. So Graham sat in the crematorium watching the evidence of his crime literally go up in smoke.
It is remarkable, and I think that there'd been this real spate of absences, of illnesses at the factory, and people were actually starting to get quite fearful about what was going around at the factory and what was hurting people, but still nobody looked at him. And then before long, another person had fallen seriously ill, Fred Biggs.
Fred Biggs, who he was a storeman who'd actually befriended Graham Young and taken him sort of under his wing. And Fred Biggs, again, felt violently ill, really sick all over the place. And again, they thought, oh, it's a virus. And again, he was rushed to hospital. The doctors around his bed, they can't work out precisely what's happened to him. But by now, there is suspicion about what's going on.
So such was the illness was so widespread and fear was rising so much that the factory actually called in public health officials to try and work out what was going on. It had become known as the Bovingdon bug.
Yeah, loads of people were going down with this sickness and they just had no idea what it was. But it all seemed to be starting in this factory. So public health inspectors were called in to talk to the staff and try and get to the bottom of this. And of course, our man, the teacup poisoner, was there. The public health inspectors are letting it be known what they think the cause of all this could be. And suddenly Graham Young starts to contradict them and say, no, this is what's actually happened. This is the drug that's causing the problem. This is the chemical that's causing the problem, etc., etc., etc. Revealing, again, far too much information. And suddenly, people start to get suspicious. Could all this be the work of Graham Young?
So the doctor went on having described this business of the analysis and so forth they'd been doing, and he came to the conclusion that we were probably suffering from some sort of hybrid flu virus, and that these things were very aggressive, and that was probably what the situation was.
In amongst the concerned staff, one man stood out from the crowd.
Graham Young then piped up and started asking questions, and there were very technical terms that he was using. I suppose in a sense we weren't so surprised because of this past experience that we thought he had.
His arrogance was such, and his knowledge was such, that he couldn't stop arguing and putting across his point of view, and it was his undoing.
And Anthony Oddums, his co-worker, actually said that there was a real sense, it was a shock, it was a real sense of betrayal, that they had worked alongside this guy and they had trusted him and they'd befriended him, and he was literally killing his co-workers.
Oh yeah, I mean, he was absolutely horrified. And I mean, we interviewed him years after the event had happened, but he was still shocked by it. It was the first time he'd spoken about it. He couldn't bear to talk about it, and this was the first interview he'd ever given on our Murder Casebook program. And he was still, you could tell, he was still visibly shocked that this could happen, and it could be, this crime could be carried out by someone they worked alongside. And even if they didn't particularly like him, at least they trusted him. You know, he was a co-worker, and certainly the two victims of Graham Young did like him, and kind of took him under their wings. You know, and it cost both of them their lives. It was quite extraordinary. But he'd given the game away, and that's when the authorities alerted the police, and that was the beginning of the end as far as Graham Young was concerned.
So the police went and searched his lodgings where he was staying, and once again, he hadn't really hidden the incriminating trail of evidence.
No, he hadn't. It was an extraordinary scene that greeted him. There were all his documents, names written down in code, the amounts of chemicals he'd given to them, on what days he'd given it to them, the effects it had had on them. It was all written down. There were various creatures in the room, dead or alive, where he'd been carrying out experiments on. It was full of Nazi gear, flags and Nazi symbols, etc. It was like a room full of Nazism, really. It was an extraordinary sight that greeted them. And of course, when Fred Biggs died, and they carried out the checks on his body, he was full of poison.
They also were able to test Bob Eagle's ashes that were left as well.
They did, and again that revealed that he hadn't died of a virus, he'd been poisoned.
So really high levels of thallium, this heavy metal thallium, in his ashes.
Massive amounts of thallium, particularly in Fred Biggs. He was absolutely full of thallium. He'd had enough to kill him 100 times over.
You know, we were a close group, very trusting and understanding of each other, and suddenly you have this situation where somebody has been very, very malicious. Within a group like that, it has a pretty profound effect on everybody. But horror, really, I suppose is the only way you can describe it.
So he's arrested, he's charged, there's a lot of evidence, and in 1972 he goes to trial at St Albans Crown Court. And Anthony Holden, your journalist that you interviewed for the programme, was there for the trial.
He was there for the trial, and the strange thing was that Graham Young sort of recognised him as the local reporter across the court, and sent messages across to him suggesting that they should meet, suggesting that he should be written of in glowing terms so that he could become famous.
He wanted to be notorious.
He wanted to be notorious, you know, but he wasn't having any of that, so they never ever did meet.
It was the first time I laid eyes on him, and it was a pretty scary sight. He was in court, his demeanour was very arrogant, detached, like one of those dictators who doesn't recognise the court, you know. He sent me notes across the court. It said, can you make me so famous that I wind up in the Chamber of Horrors at Madame Tussauds? I want to go down in history as a really famous murderer.
One of the things he actually said to Anthony Holden, the journalist, is that he wanted to be in Madame Tussauds' Chamber of Horrors.
Yes, he did. And Anthony Holden also said that it was quite extraordinary that during breaks in the court case, members of the jury and members of the press would be in the same room having coffee. But of course, the jury didn't know, because such is the way of the law, the jury didn't know about Graham Young's previous convictions, you know, the poisoning of his father, stepmother and sister. They didn't know about that, but the journalist did. And the journalist was so tempted to say to them, look, this guy's done this before. You know, he's a prolific poisoner of other people. But they couldn't. They weren't allowed to do that. So, and I think Holden was actually worried that Graham Young might get away with it, because Graham Young had tried all sorts of stunts, like saying, "Oh, the stuff in my notebooks, it's not really true. It's nonsense," you know. So Holden was concerned that the jury might let him off.
The irony of the whole trial was that we journalists knew about poisoning his family when he was a teenager, 8 years in Broadmoor. Obviously the jury did not know about that, because you're not allowed to raise previous convictions during a trial. And we would often be in the canteen drinking a cup of tea with the jury. It was so tempting in that absurd way to go across and say, "Hey, do you know he's done it before?" Because you can never tell during a trial what impression the evidence is making on the jury.
So the diaries played a large part of the prosecution's evidence. He actually took the stand himself, Graham Young, in his own defence, but it seems that all he did was just argue with the points that the experts had made.
He couldn't stop himself arguing with the experts. This had been his undoing. It was why he got sent to Broadmoor in the first place, because he would argue with experts, argue with doctors. And it's what's brought him into court here, charged with 2 murders.
The jury took very little time to deliberate, and what was the verdict?
The verdict was guilty. Guilty on 2 counts of murder, and he was given life sentences on both counts. I think he could have gone back to Broadmoor had he so chosen, but he didn't. He went to Parkhurst Prison on the Isle of Wight, and that's where he served out his time. He died on August the 1st, 1990, aged 42. Again, there's a mystery about how Graham Young died, because it was said he died of heart failure, but he'd had no history of heart problems. It was claimed also that he might have been murdered, either by fellow prisoners who were nervous of having him around for obvious reasons. Bobby Cummins even suggested that he might have been murdered by prison officers, although there's absolutely nothing to suggest that might be the case. And Professor David Wilson suggested he might even have committed suicide.
I mean, he had been known earlier in life, or had been thought earlier in life, to have been carrying a so-called exit dose of poison around with him in case he needed to take his own life.
Well, even when he was young, when he'd been poisoning his dad and his stepmother and his sister, he had a little phial of poison which he kept in his pocket to take should he need to, should he be apprehended. And of course, he never got that chance. So he could, as David Wilson said, Professor David Wilson said, he could have committed suicide. We shall never know.
There is a fascinating thing that he said after he was convicted, and he was asked if he had any remorse or any regret for his actions. And I think his answer really sums up the condition, his psychological condition.
What he said was, "What I feel is the emptiness of my soul." And that's an epitaph, really, for Graham Young, the teacup poisoner.
He had no compunction, no remorse, no guilt about inflicting terrible pain and, in some cases, death.
He really was a remorseless killer, and actually he did manage to achieve his aim of ending up in Madame Tussauds.
The extraordinary thing was, yes, he got his dream wish in the end. He finished up a statue in Madame Tussauds in London. It would have made him incredibly happy.
Thank you so much, Fred. It's such a fascinating case, and we'll see you next time for more of Fred Dinenage's Murder Casebook Reopened. Hi, welcome to Fred Dinenage's Murder Casebook Reopened. I'm Hayley Rhodes, and I'm here with Fred.
I'm delighted to be here with you again, except not so delighted with this particular case.
I have to admit that I found the details of this story absolutely revolting. I actually had to keep looking away and sort of blocking my ears. It's not a nice one.
John George Haigh.
John George Haigh.
Acid bath killer. A really, really unpleasant serial killer. Used sulfuric acid to try and dispose of 6 bodies. Successfully in 3 cases, not quite so successfully in the other 3, and that, of course, led to his undoing.
John George Haigh was the serial killer from Middle England who killed the middle class.
He had no compunction and no conscience whatsoever about killing people to obtain his ends.
The sludge at the bottom of the barrels in which he's dissolved these poor people is poured down the drains. You know, he's literally obliterating an entire family.
One of the most unpleasant kinds of no serial killer is pleasant, but this is a particularly unpleasant kind because he killed without mercy all of his victims, and he indeed claimed another 3, which was never proven, but he killed without mercy and purely for greed, to satisfy his own lust for money, for the good life. A really, really unpleasant con man and serial killer.
He did have a start in life that you'd think would have set him up for a certain amount of morality.
Yes, he did. I mean, he came from Stamford in Lincolnshire, of a perfectly pleasant family. They were deeply religious, his parents, and belonged to a sect known as the Plymouth Brethren, which doesn't except Christmas Day, for example. So it was quite a strict upbringing, a lonely sort of upbringing, really, although he was quite a bright child at school, and strangely discovered very early on that he was able to forge the signatures of all sorts of other people very accurately, which helped him later in his life as a con man, or what we'd call these days a scammer.
So he went to a very prestigious school in Wakefield, which actually has the dubious claim to fame of being the home of another serial killer from the area, a guy called Stephen Griffiths, who sort of 60-odd years later would go on to become a serial killer. So he went to this very prestigious school. He left at 17, and he immediately went into the world of work.
He did, and immediately, or almost immediately, into the world of crime as well, because he began a company selling cars which actually didn't exist. So he'd started his scamming, his conning career, got caught out, and served the first of his jail sentences for fraud, several jail sentences for fraud.
So around 1933, 1934, he actually meets a woman and marries. She becomes pregnant, but almost immediately he's actually jailed for the frauds he's been committing.
Indeed, and then she gave the child away. She left him and she gave the child away, which is terribly unsatisfactory. But yes, he'd served time for fraud, then moved down when he came out, down to London, and got involved. He did a bit of chauffeuring, that sort of thing, and then got involved in another fraud. He set up a totally fictitious solicitor's business with, I think, 3 different offices. And again, that led to his undoing, because on the headed notepaper of one, which was based in Guildford in Surrey, he'd actually, for some extraordinary reason, misspelt Guildford. He'd missed out the D in Guildford. He was selling phony share certificates and things like that. One of his customers spotted that misspelling, alerted the police, and that again led to another jail sentence for fraud.
So you met Bobby Cummins in the programme, and he is an ex-offender, and he actually explained to you that for some people, going to prison isn't necessarily a rehabilitation activity. It's actually a place where they can learn how to be better criminals, and that does seem to have been the case with Haigh.
Bobby Cummins describes prison as the greatest university in the world.
If you're in prison and you want to leave crime behind, it can be a great place for rehabilitation. If, like Haigh, you were a prolific offender, if you like, you had it in you, you wanted to learn about crime. Greatest university in the world is prison, because there you can network, there are people there with different skills. So he would have been planning his next move.
He said you've got the choice when you go into prison. You can use the opportunities to learn a trade in prison. You can use the opportunity to get in the library and learn about life and about business. On the other hand, if you are so inclined, you can meet all sorts of other villains who will give you all sorts of tips for the future when you get out, if you want to continue your life of crime. And that's what happened to him. He was surrounded by con men, fellow con men, so he could learn an awful lot for them. He read a lot in the prison library. He read about a French serial killer who disposed of bodies using sulfuric acid. And that gave the acid bath murderer, as he was later to be called, that gave him lots and lots of tips for the future.
This is where the story starts to get very macabre.
Yes, it does, because he found himself working in the prison workshop. He would pay other prisoners when they were out in the grounds of the prison to try and find field mice, little creatures like that, which they'd then give to him in exchange for money. he would experiment by putting these little creatures in jars, jugs filled with acid, to see if he could dissolve them, etc. And that gave him the idea for his crimes when he left prison.
And the reason that he realised that he wanted to kind of work this method out of getting rid of bodies is because he'd realised that if you're going to commit fraud, the people who stand in the way of you and success are the people that you've defrauded. They've seen your face, they know who you are, they can give evidence against you. And so he's realised that he needs to make this leap from fraud to killing so that he can cover his tracks.
Yes, and get rid of the bodies completely, which in the first few instances he was very, very good at. But then, of course, it all went wrong, as we will explain during this conversation.
So he's released from prison and he starts work for an engineering firm. But it seems that being a salary man is not for Haigh. It seems to him that it's actually less effort to be a criminal than it is to just go to work and earn money. And I think that you spoke with Professor David Wilson for the programme, and he had a theory that this very austere, isolated childhood that he'd had with his parents had given him a taste for the high life. Essentially, he wanted what other people had. He wanted to have lots of money and to live a good life. And he knew that just working for a wage wasn't the way to do that. Yeah. So that's one of the theories as to why he's drawn to fraud and to making kind of big money the easy way.
He always, I think, reading through the lines, felt slightly outside of the culture to which he belonged. And so a lot of his life, it would seem, was about playing a part. So he always wanted to drive fast cars, to look the part, to be fashionable, to have money. He often gives the impression of trying to live above his means.
So he comes out of prison, he gets a job for a while, doesn't really enjoy it, and so he meets up with an old employer who he used to drive for called William McSwan.
William McSwan, interesting man, the son of fairly wealthy parents. They met up again. They started meeting for drinks and meals, etc. And he went out with... McSwan would often go out. The parents had properties all over London. And McSwan would go out and collect the rental from these properties. And sometimes our man Haigh would go out with him. And he'd see fairly large amounts of money changing hands. And he thought to himself, I'd really like that money.
So William McSwan's wealthy parents actually owned some clubs with games machines, and the sort of pretext for luring McSwan to his workshop was that he could actually fix some pinball machines that weren't working properly. And that was how Haigh actually got McSwan to go to his workshop. Yes,
I mean, Haigh said to him, look, I've got just the equipment you need. I can solve all your problems very cheaply. You're my friend, you know, let me do this for you, you know. And of course, McSwan fell for it. Quite what his reaction would have been when he got to the workshop and saw the somewhat tatty state it was in and the lack of equipment that Haigh claimed he'd got, we shall never know, because, of course, within a matter of seconds of entering that workshop, he was dead, clubbed to death with a piece of lead piping.
So he put together this absolutely macabre outfit to carry out these crimes.
Oh, utterly bizarre, yes. A kind of rubber outfit, almost like a wetsuit to protect his body from the sulfuric acid. Rubber boots, indeed. Rubber gloves. A gas mask to cover his face so he wasn't inhaling the fumes from the sulfuric acid. He would have been a really horrifying, scary sight with all this gear on, you know, but it was protecting him and putting the fear of God up anybody else, I would have thought. The body was put in this barrel of sulfuric acid to see how successfully he could get rid of the body, which was very successful indeed. He then went and saw McSwan's parents, who were concerned about the disappearance of their son, and he said to them, look, he's my friend. He was going to be called up for national service, conscripted. He didn't want to do it. So what he's done is your son's gone to Scotland just to lay low for a while.
Because this is right in the middle of the Second World War.
Middle of the Second World War. So he's in Scotland. So don't worry, everything's fine. And the parents believed him.
They actually let him take on McSwan's role of collecting rents. So he sort of really ingratiated himself with the family.
So with their son allegedly hiding away in Scotland, Haigh was allowed by McSwan's parents to collect the rent that the son had been collecting from the various properties around London. And a year went by and he was getting away with this story. And then he went to McSwan's parents and said to them, oh, your son's come back now, the war's over, your son's back in London, but he's still hiding away from the authorities. He's at my workshop in the Gloucester Road. Come along and meet him. So the dad, Donald McSwan, fell for the story, went to the workshop in Gloucester Road, was taken in there, was shown the same bench with the same sort of documentation on it, the same papers on it, bent over, and the same thing happened again. Up came Haigh with a piece of lead piping, smashed him on the head and killed him. He then went and found McSwan's mother and said, your husband is in my workshop, but he's fallen ill. He desperately needs you. She fell for it. She went round to the workshop as well and again got beaten over the head with a piece of lead piping. So he's now got the two bodies there, one in each of two different barrels of sulfuric acid. So he'd got rid of the son and the parents. He was able to access their bank accounts, etc., sell a lot of their property, and suddenly was a very, very wealthy man indeed. Moved into a very smart hotel called the Onslow Court Hotel in Knightsbridge in London, and was living a life of Riley.
He actually managed to live a couple of years, didn't he, on the proceeds of these sales, and he's living a good life.
Oh, he had so much money. It should have lasted him for years and years and years, but he was a big gambler, had a really exotic social life, an expensive social life. And within 2 or 3 years, believe it or not, the vast amount of money that he'd stolen was gone. And he got away with it because he'd said to friends of the McSwans, oh, they've emigrated to Australia, they've all gone to Australia, etc. And he got away with it. So he thought.
So he starts to run low on funds after a couple of years, and he realises that he needs new victims. He introduces himself to quite a wealthy young couple called Rose and Archie Henderson, who have advertised a house for sale.
Yes. So he ingratiates himself with the Hendersons, actually puts in an offer for the house way over what they'd actually advertised it for. So they're thinking, here's a young man. And he's a very smart man, Haigh. I mean, he was incredibly well groomed, the brill-creamed hair. He had all the conversation, all the chat.
Charming and plausible,
he was.
Fun.
Yes, a really nice young man, apparently, on the surface. He even stole a gun from the Hendersons, from their house. And again, we go through the same little charade, but now he's left that workshop in Gloucester Road in London, where in fact, how that worked was, when the bodies, the 3 people that he'd murdered, when the bodies in the sulfuric acid had dissolved, he poured the residue down a drain in the corner, and it all washed away and finished up, believe it or not, in the River Thames. But now, by the time he's met the Hendersons and he's running short of money, he's no longer in that workshop in Gloucester Road. He's now moved to a little workshop in a pretty rough and ready builder's yard in Crawley in West Sussex. So that's where he is now, and that's where it all starts to unravel. So he says to the Hendersons, I've got this great business idea. To Archie Henderson, the older man, come and look at this and see what you think. So again, Henderson falls for it, just as the McSwans had before, goes to Crawley, to this really rough and ready workshop in a builder's yard. Goodness knows what he thought about it when he got there, but he's taken inside. He's shown again some come and have a look at this, my plans. Starts to bend over the bench. Haigh takes out a revolver, the revolver he's stolen from the Hendersons, and shoots him in the back of the head. That's his next victim.
It wouldn't be very easy these days to get hold of something like sulfuric acid, especially in huge quantities. How did he manage it back then?
Again, another con. He simply, again, printed false note paper. I've got an engineering company. I need some sulfuric acid for the work I'm carrying out. That was all he needed then to get the vast quantities, and they were vast quantities of this highly lethal sulfuric acid. He got hold of it.
Yeah, I mean, these were 40-gallon drums, and he got through 6 of them.
Yeah, huge amounts of sulfuric acid. But again, he was a smooth-talking con man. Not a problem.
So this is where an experiment that Professor David Wilson, the criminologist, did with you comes into the story, because he showed you what happens if you dissolve a piece of fresh chicken in sulfuric acid to kind of mimic on a much smaller scale what Haigh had been doing with people's bodies. And we'll come to what the outcome of that was later. But he kind of showed that there was a flaw creeping into Haig's otherwise relatively flawless plan that he'd been using.
David, tell us what we're seeing here.
Well, for any murderer to be successful, he's got to get rid of the body. And in controlled circumstances, and using the lovely Jerry, we're going to replicate the kinds of behavior that Haigh showed with his victims, which we're going to use concentrated sulfuric acid, not the body of a person, but a piece of chicken, and see how long it's going to take to dissolve, which is, of course, what Haigh did with his victims. Now, of course, remember, it's a microcosm, so we've only got 2 litres of concentrated sulfuric acid. Haigh had 3 carboys of sulfuric acid, which literally, a carboy is 40 gallons, so he has 120 gallons of this stuff, because, of course, he's trying to get rid of a much bigger body than our small piece of chicken.
The piece of chicken's been in there, what, 5 minutes, and already it's appearing to, if you like, cook.
Yes, well, it's going to burn. This is the process of how the body fat will disappear.
How difficult would it have been for him, do you imagine, to do this for the first time with a human body?
Oh, incredibly difficult. Most murderers, when they start, if you think of murder almost as a skill, when you pick up a skill for the first time, you're not very good at it. And of course, most murderers are dealing with a range of emotions that they're going through when they have the control over their victim. Some of them might be excited, some of them might be frightened, some of them might be anxious. But of course, they're learning how to deal with somebody they've got in their complete and utter power.
There is something still left behind. There's a bit of fat left behind, possibly a bit of bone left behind. Not everything completely disappears. Now, that was fine in the case of that workshop in Gloucester Road in London, because everything went down the drain and finished up in the River Thames. But the problem with the workshop at Crawley was there was no drain. So he's got this problem now. What do I do with the residue that's left? He puts
Archie Henderson into the barrel of acid.
Yeah.
He dissolves his body. He's got this sort of sludgy waste left over.
Yes, which he then pours into a bit of rubble at the far end of the building site where the workshop is located. And he thought that was fine. But of course it wasn't in the end. It was his undoing. And the same thing happened to Henderson's wife, Rose. She was invited round to the workshop and again shot in the back of the head, put in the barrel of sulfuric acid. Again, there's residue left. And again, he poured it in the corner of the building site, which he thought was fine because there was no drain there. But he thought, that's fine. No one's ever going to find that. There's nothing left anyway. So he thought. And again, he then accessed their fortune.
Yep, sold off all their properties. They had a number of properties which
Correct.
they'd been gaining rent from, and he sold off all their properties, and he made himself enough to live for another year or so.
Yes.
And he seems to have been labouring under this misapprehension about what it takes for the police to be able to prosecute murders. He seemed to have had this belief that it was impossible for the police to prosecute a murder without a body. So he thought every single time that by disposing of the bodies like this, he was making himself completely infallible.
He did think that, which of course is absolute nonsense, you know. But in any case, in the end, it was discovered, the Home Office pathologist discovered in that residue which he'd poured at the far end of the builder's yard, in there they found body fat, they found a piece of leg, a piece of foot, piece of foot bone, they found some dentures.
Apparently they found a gallstone, I've discovered, and apparently gallstones are very recognisable on their own. And he found a gallstone, one of the pathologists found a gallstone just kind of kicking around in the rubble and recognised it as such, which is absolutely fascinating.
And he was incredibly careless in the end, was Haigh, because they also found a receipt from a dry cleaner's, from a coat of his next victim.
Yeah, so the next victim. So Haigh had been living again in the Onslow Court Hotel in South Kensington, very posh part of London, and it was frequented by these usually elderly, usually very rich women who lived there or who came there on shopping trips. And you actually met a man called Richard Franklin, whose aunts had also been frequent visitors to the Onslow Court Hotel and had interacted with Haigh.
Yes, he spoke about his aunt, Flossie, I think her name was.
Yeah.
Who would every few weeks go with her friend to London for a nice little shopping trip, would go to Harrods, they'd have their hair done, their nails done, etc. They would stay for a couple of nights at the Onslow Court Hotel, and that's where they made contact, or Haigh made contact with them, because he could see, possible, I need more money now, the money's running out. A couple of well-heeled ladies, these, I'll just chat them up, and that's what he did, you know.
Well, my aunt Irene, known as Flossie, and Sally were very typical country women. They would come up to London once a fortnight to do their shopping at Harrods, as you do, and have their hair done. And they would spend the weekend at the Onslow Court Hotel, which was very comfortable. They could feel at home, and the sort of people who went there were similar people, probably people who were living on family trusts. But, it is significant, this, because the money that they would have was probably not as much as they would like to have had. So I think if a very smooth operator comes along and chats them up and tells them about his wonderful business opportunity, and I think they might have thought it was, that's rather exciting. Perhaps we can improve our income a little bit.
Did your aunt ever say to you that she'd had conversations with Haigh?
Oh, yes. Yes, he used to sit down and have tea with them. He was charming. He would go around, and obviously he was sussing out the field.
And Richard Franklin, I think, he said his auntie was very gullible, and had she been asked for money, had she been asked to invest, she would probably have done so. But I think Haigh thought, no, these two haven't got quite enough money. I want a bigger fish than this. So actually let them off the hook. They were very, very lucky, particularly his auntie. Very lucky. But he did find another victim at the Onslow Court Hotel, didn't he?
So Olive Durand Deacon, another very wealthy elderly woman, she was apparently always, dripping with jewellery when she came down for dinner at the Onslow Court Hotel. She wore these big fur coats. She lived there permanently in what was apparently a very expensive, lovely suite. So she obviously had a great deal of money behind her.
Yes, and Haigh would have spotted straight away, this is a potential victim, this is perfect for me. So he made sure he was able occasionally to sit with her at dinner in the hotel on the same table and strike up conversation with her. And of course, he's a charming young man, he's immaculately dressed, the hair's always perfect, lovely conversation. Bright young man, full of ideas, full of great business schemes, etc. And he talked her into believing all this. And I've got this great idea, I know you're wealthy, but you can make even more money. And again, he lured her to that same workshop in Crawley.
So she was entrepreneurial, wasn't she, actually, considering that she came from wealth. She had this idea for, so false nails had recently become a thing, which I had no idea that false nails went that far back. Yeah. But false nails were becoming a thing, and she had this idea for manufacturing and selling false nails. And she, as he apparently came from this engineering background, so he said she thought that maybe she could use his expertise and they could go into business together.
Yeah, and very clever, she fell for it completely, hook, line and sinker, and she was a clever woman. So he said, look, let's go and talk about this. I've got this workshop in Crawley, in Sussex. Let's go there, and we can talk about it in more detail, and I can show you the sort of equipment I've got. Of course, he hadn't got any equipment at all, really, but she fell for it, as you probably would. Went to Crawley, was led into this dreadful old workshop. Goodness knows what she thought when she walked in there. She must have been horrified and thought, what's going on here? This isn't not at all what I expected. I was expecting, really sophisticated equipment. It's an absolute dump. What's going on? And while she's thinking this, Haigh is behind her with the revolver in his hand and blew her brains out from behind her. His next victim. Into the barrel of sulfuric acid, and the same process repeated over again. Victim number 6, body number 6, dissolved, or so he thought.
So he disposes of Olive Durand Deacon's body of this kind of dissolved sludge in the corner of the yard. 2 days later, her friend Constance Lane actually reports her missing. And amazingly, this is the first of his victims to be reported missing. But I guess this is at a time when people don't have telephones. People, if they live in different parts of the country, don't see each other frequently. So it had just not been noticed that any of the other people had gone missing, or had not enough to raise alarm. But on this occasion, she lived in the hotel. She hadn't turned up for dinner. And so her friend goes into the local police station and reports her missing.
Yeah, that's absolutely right. And the police were fascinated by this. They thought something strange is going on. So they went round to the Onslow Court Hotel to meet the people staying there. And they felt that Haigh was a bit out of place there. There were much older people there. But Haigh was living amongst them, you know. And
he's only in his 30s. And there's all of these old, sort of wealthy old ladies and this young man in his 30s.
Relatively young man. He'd been living there for quite a long time, you know, and obviously spending a lot of money there, you know. Suddenly Haigh was on their radar. He suddenly interested them, you know, and they started to look into his affairs and then discovered information about the workshop at Crawley.
I think they actually went back and discovered for his various convictions for fraud from his past, which nobody in his present had known about.
Indeed, they discovered that he had a criminal past, that he'd been inside, he'd done time, he'd been involved in fraud, etc., etc. Suddenly, he's completely on their radar. He's of great interest to the police, and that's when they begin investigating his so-called business life.
They go down to this yard in Crawley where his engineering workshop is, and that's where I think they start by going inside the workshop, and they find things that you wouldn't expect. I think they found a gun, they found bullets, they found things, the gas mask, they found things that were highly suspicious.
Yes, they found all this equipment that he'd been wearing to protect his own body, his own skin from the sulfuric acid. They found the gun that he'd used to kill his victims. They found bullets as well. All sorts of interesting information, including a receipt from a dry cleaners where a coat of one of his victims had been taken. So all sorts of very interesting, incriminating evidence.
But not as incriminating as what they find when they go out into the yard. So they bring in this forensic pathologist called Professor Keith Simpson.
Yes.
And he goes out into this builder's yard, and one of the first things he finds, just rolling around on the floor, is a gallstone, which he instantly recognises from doing autopsies on dead bodies. And then he starts to look even further.
Professor Simpson, a very, very clever man indeed. Yes, suddenly, I mean, he's completely alert now to something very strange and horrible going on. So he finds a gallstone, he finds a piece of bone from a foot, he finds some leftovers of dentures that haven't been destroyed because it hasn't all disappeared. And he finds the residue of body fat as well.
28 pounds of body fat. And
28 pounds of body fat, can you believe it? Which
it's like
Haigh,
something out of Fight Club.
yeah, which Haigh thought, you know, had gone, which of course in the case of his first 3 victims, it had gone down the drain. But in Crawley, it hadn't gone. It was lying in the rubble at the back of this builder's yard. And suddenly, the game was over.
So another thing that they found at this workshop was a dry cleaning ticket. And when they went to the dry cleaners, they discovered there a fur coat that had belonged to Olive Durand Deacon.
Yeah.
So they had this very direct link between that workshop and one of the victims.
Yeah, because he'd stolen her coat, taken it to the dry cleaners, thinking, well, you know, I'll sell that. Always looking for ways to make a bit more money. And of course, that linked him straight away, directly, to the murder of that woman.
So when he was questioned by the police, he wasn't shy about saying, yes, I've killed all of these 6 people. I mean, firstly, I think that he thought that they couldn't prosecute him because there were no bodies, which was obviously a huge misapprehension. But also he had a strategy. He had another con, that he was going to pretend to be insane.
Yes, he's going to pretend to be insane and going to pretend that he actually drank the blood of his victims, which of course was proved to be absolute and utter nonsense because it would be an almost impossible thing to do. But yeah, he was trying to plead insanity. I didn't know what I was doing, you know, I just needed to drink their blood. A cunning ploy, but never going to work.
So when the trial came around at Lewis Crown Court, it was a huge sensation because you've got this guy who's been dubbed in the press the vampire, and people were queuing to attend the trial. And you spoke to a man called Vernon Evershed, who was actually a newspaper copy boy who attended the trial.
He was the copy boy on the local paper in Lewis. And of course, this was the days before, television, before the internet. So people relied on newspapers for their coverage of this extraordinary trial. Huge crowds were outside Lewis Crown Court to see this monster being tried for the murder of all these people. It attracted national interest via the newspapers, and he was the copy boy on the local paper and was in court to see a lot of the trial and to see Haigh.
There was a lot more interest in that sort of case because, bearing in mind there's no TV, it made it a sensational story and was the talk of the day. People talked about it at work. What's happened today? They've brought the oil drums in today and all this sort of business. There were 33 witnesses. Some of them virtually only said one or two words like yes or no. Did you see Mrs. Dew and Deacon come back into the hotel? No.
So one of the fascinating pieces of evidence that was brought up in court, so he had claimed that he was a vampire, that he was drinking blood.
Yes.
It was part of his insanity defence. And they brought in a doctor who said that, well, actually, after Archie Henderson's murder, he went down the road and got himself egg on toast.
Yeah.
And he ate a few rounds of egg on toast and then came back and apparently drank blood. And, just wouldn't be possible for the human body to actually ingest a pint of blood and egg on toast without throwing up, which, seems to me like not the most scientific of evidence, but...
Yeah, but it just shows you what a cold-hearted killer Haigh was, that he would have killed a man, put the body in the sulfuric acid, then pop down the road to the local cafe to have poached eggs on toast, quite happily, and a nice cup of coffee, a cup of tea. Then go back, and he claimed, drink some of the victim's blood. But of course, had he done so, he would have been violently ill, violently sick. So it was a crazy idea.
It was. So none of this really washed with the jury. He wasn't convincing. And after a very short period of deliberation, they found him guilty.
Found him guilty and ordered that he be hanged, which he eventually was, by the executioner, Albert Pierpoint.
So he was convicted by the jury after just 15 minutes.
Yeah.
That's a pretty quick turnaround.
Yeah, well, he was so obviously guilty. And the evidence was all there in the builder's yard in Crawley. He was caught bang to rights in actual fact. So there was no doubt that he was guilty and that he wasn't insane. He was just a cold, calculating, remorseless serial killer.
And that's the thing, it was purely for gain. And actually what's one of the interesting things that came out during the programme when you spoke to David Wilson is the idea that it's actually quite unusual to kill someone in the first instance purely for gain, but actually once you've killed one person, each subsequent murder becomes a lot easier and you become a lot less squeamish and have a lot less compunction. And in fact, he wrote letters to his family from prison before his execution, in which he didn't really express anything in the way of remorse or regret or conscience. He really did have no compunction whatsoever about taking all these lives.
Bobby Cummins, the ex-convict, said, that serial killers must have, or any sort of killer who does it for gain, must have this ability to switch off, emotions, be totally cold-hearted about it, and not to think about it afterwards. And Bobby would say, once a serial killer has killed his first victim, if he's done it successfully in his own mind, then subsequent victims become much easier to kill and not a problem. And that was certainly the case with Haigh. There was no problem at all, no conscience, no difficulty about it. He conditioned his mind to accept it, not to have any regrets.
So to find out more about this story, you actually spoke with a guy called David Briffett in Lewis Crown Court, where the trial was eventually to happen.
We did. It was a fascinating day. David Briffett, who's a real expert on Haigh, wrote a book about him, done tremendous research on him. And I spoke to him at great length in Lewis Crown Court where Haigh was actually tried and found guilty. That I found absolutely fascinating. And also going to Leopold Road in Crawley, where the workshop had been, no longer there, now quite a pleasant area of houses and this little bit of almost waste ground, but no longer a builder's site, no longer any rubble there, no longer a workshop, of course. That was completely torn down. So a fascinating case to work on, and some fascinating people to meet along the way, including David Brivett, of course, who knows more than anybody about the acid bath murderer.
Well, I have a theory about Mr. Haigh, and I'm pretty sure that he wanted to assume the lifestyle of other people that he admired. And the reason for that can be traced right back to his very strange childhood. His parents were members of the Plymouth Brethren, and he was deprived of many things. They didn't celebrate Christmas, and eventually, when he discovered the outside world, he rather liked it, and he wanted to be part of it, and he was prepared to go to more or less any lengths to obtain that better lifestyle.
I really enjoyed talking to David Brivett because he'd obviously done such research on Haigh, and sadly he passed away in 2018. Great loss.
This is a truly horrifying case. The details are absolutely horrific. It must have been a fascinating one to make a show about.
It was indeed a fascinating case to work on, but nonetheless, John George Haigh, one of the worst serial killers it's ever been my misfortune to come across.
That's all we've got time for, but we will see you next time for more of Fred Dinenage's Murder Casebook Reopened.